Welcome, dear friend. I know you watch this video to fall asleep, so before that, like, comment, and share this video. Also, where are you from and what time is it where you are from? Tonight, as you settle into the gentle embrace of sleep, allow yourself to be carried away on a journey through 10 timeless Buddhist tales that have whispered wisdom to countless souls across the centuries. These stories, born from the depths of ancient teachings and refined through generations of spiritual seekers, offer something far more precious than mere entertainment. Each narrative we'll explore together serves as a doorway into profound understanding, a gentle guide toward inner peace, and a companion for your journey toward restful slumber. As your breathing naturally deepens and your body releases the tensions of the day, these sacred stories will work their quiet magic, planting seeds of wisdom that will continue to flourish in the garden of your consciousness. The Buddhist tradition has always recognized the power of storytelling to convey truths that the logical mind sometimes struggles to grasp. Through parables and teaching tales, the Buddha and his followers discovered ways to transmit the most essential insights about human nature, suffering, and the path to liberation. Tonight, these same stories will serve not only as vehicles for wisdom, but as gentle lullabies for your restless thoughts. Prepare yourself now for a collection of tales that speak to the deepest questions of existence while nurturing your soul toward peaceful rest. Let your mind become like still water, perfectly receptive to the ripples of ancient wisdom that are about to unfold. The first story, The Master and the Empty Bowl. In a mountain monastery high above the clouds, where morning mist danced between ancient pine trees, lived a revered Zen master, known for his simple yet profound teachings. Students from across the land would climb the treacherous paths to seek his guidance, each carrying their own burdens and questions about the nature of existence. One autumn day, as golden leaves spiraled down from the surrounding trees, a wealthy merchant arrived at the monastery gates. This man had accumulated vast riches through his trading ventures, owned multiple homes in different provinces, and commanded the respect of many in the business world. Yet despite all his material success, a deep emptiness gnawed at his heart like a persistent ache. The merchant was ushered into the master's simple chamber, a room containing nothing but a low wooden table, 2 cushions, and a single scroll hanging on the wall. The contrast between his elaborate silk robes and the master's plain cotton garments could not have been more striking. After offering the customary greetings, the merchant began to speak of his predicament. He described his successful enterprises, his comfortable lifestyle, and the envy of his peers. Yet he confessed that despite having everything he had once dreamed of possessing, he felt more hollow with each passing day. The joy he expected from his achievements never arrived, and each new acquisition only seemed to deepen his sense of dissatisfaction. The master listened with complete attention, his weathered face revealing neither judgment nor surprise. When the merchant finished his tale of success tinged with sorrow, the old teacher rose without a word and disappeared into an adjoining room. He returned carrying a beautiful ceramic bowl, perfectly crafted and elegant in its simplicity. The merchant admired its graceful curves and the way sunned surface. The light played across its glass. Master placed the bowl on the low table between them and sat back down. The wealthy visitor waited for some explanation of the bowl's significance, perhaps expecting a metaphor about emptiness or fullness, success or failure. Instead, the master simply gestured toward the bowl and asked a single question that would change everything. The merchant stared at the empty bowl, his mind racing through possible meanings and interpretations. Was the master suggesting that his life was empty like the bowl? Was this a lesson about the void that material possessions cannot fill? Perhaps the bowl represented the Buddhist concept of emptiness, or maybe it symbolized the potential for new beginnings. Minutes passed in silence, a seize resting G. The merchant wrestled with the puzzle before him. The master sat perfectly still, his gently on his visitoration. the only without any trace of impatience or expect sounds, with a gentle whisper of wind through the pine trees outside, and the distant tinkling of a wind chime. Finally, unable to contain his frustration any longer, the merchant asked what lesson the bowl was meant to teach. The master's response came like the first ray of dawn breaking through darkness, illuminating truths that had been hidden in plain sight. Through this simple exchange, the merchant began to understand something that years of philosophical study might never have revealed. The master's teaching was not contained in complex theories or elaborate explanations, but in the direct experience of observing his own mind's restless search for meaning in external objects. As the afternoon wore on, the two men sat together in comfortable silence, the empty bowl serving as a silent teacher more eloquent than any sermon. The merchant felt something shifting within him, a gradual release of the compulsive need to fill every moment and every space with acquisitions and achievements. When evening shadows began to lengthen across the monastery grounds, the merchant prepared to take his leave. He bowed deeply to the master, understanding now that the greatest teachings often come not through lengthy dissertations, but through moments of pure presence and direct seeing. The master walked him to the gate, and as they parted, he offered one final gift. From his robes, he produced a simple wooden bowl, rough and unadorned, clearly made by inexperienced hands. He placed it in the merchant's palms, and as their eyes met, both men smiled with the recognition of profound understanding passing between them. The second story. The monk who to worry forgot. Deep in a forest where ancient trees stretched their limbs toward heaven like prayers made manifest, there stood a small temple dedicated to the practice of mindful living. This humble sanctuary was home to Brother Tenzo, a monk whose approach to daily life had become legendary among those unlike many spiritual practitioners who carried the weight of their practice like a heavy burden. Brother Tenzo moved through his days with a lightness that seemed to emanate from his very being. His fellow monks often marveled at his consistent cheerfulness, especially given the challenging circumstances that frequently arose in their simple mountain community. The temple faced numerous hardships that would test anyone's equanimity. Harsh winters brought bitter cold and food shortages. Summer droughts threatened their small garden. Wild animals sometimes destroyed weeks of careful work in a single night. Yet through each trial, Brother Tenzo maintained a presence that seemed untouched by the storms of circumstance. One particularly difficult spring, when late snow had killed many of their seedlings, and their food stores were running dangerously low, a group of younger monks approached Brother Tenzo with their concerns. They found him in the garden, calmly examining the damaged plants with the same attention he might give to a beautiful flower in full bloom. The worried monks began listing all the problems facing their community. They spoke of the failed crops, the dwindling rice supplies, the repairs needed on the temple roof before the rainy season, and the uncertainty of whether they would have enough food to last until the next harvest. Brother Tenzo listened to their litany of concerns with genuine compassion, nodding at each point they raised. When they finished, he stood quietly among the frost-damaged plants for several moments, his face reflecting neither dismissal of their worries nor anxiety about their situation. Then, with the same gentle attention he had given to their concerns, he pointed to a small green shoot pushing through the partially frozen soil. Despite the harsh conditions, despite the setbacks that had destroyed so many other plants, this tiny manifestation of life had found a way to emerge into the world. The youngest monk in the group asked Brother Tenzo directly how he managed when faced to remain so peaceful with such obvious challenges. Surely some must feel anxiety about their situation. Didn't he worry about what might happen if their circumstances grew worse? Brother Tenzo's response came not in the form of philosophical explanation, but through a simple demonstration that would remain etched in their memories for years to come. He nodded, gently clearing out beside the small green shoot, and began away the debris that surrounded it, speaking softly as he worked. His words revealed a way of engaging with difficulty that transformed problems from sources of suffering into opportunities for presence and skillful action. Rather than allowing his mind to race ahead into imagined future scenarios or backward into regrets about past decisions, he remained fully engaged with whatever task was directly before him. As the monks watched him tend to the small plant with complete attention, they began to understand something profound about the nature of worry and its relationship to effective action. They saw how their mental energy, when consumed by anxiety about potential future problems, became unavailable for addressing present realities with and skill clarity. Brother Tenzo showed them that genuine care for their community was not diminished by releasing, but rather enhanced by it. When worry, the mind was not clouded by anxious projections, it could perceive situations more clearly and respond with greater wisdom and creativity. The small green shoot became a teacher in that moment, demonstrating how life finds a way to flourish even under adverse conditions, when it remains fully present to current circumstances, rather than being paralyzed by fear of future challenges. As the seasons turned and their community navigated the difficulties that had seemed so overwhelming, the monks discovered that Brother Tenzo's approach was not naive optimism, but a profound understanding of where their energy could be most effectively applied. Problems were solved not through worry, but through presence, skillful action, and trust in their ability to meet each challenge as it arose. The temple not only survived that difficult period, but emerged stronger, having learned valuable lessons about resilience, community cooperation, and the power of maintaining clarity in the face of uncertainty. Brother Tenzo's gift to them was not the elimination of problems, but a transformation in their relationship to the inevitable challenges that life presents. Years later, when visitors would ask about the secret of their community's remarkable harmony and effectiveness, the monks would often share the story of Brother Tenzo and the small green shoot, explaining how they learned that peace does not require the absence of difficulties, but rather a different way of meeting them. Through this teaching, they discovered that worry is optional, while care is essential, and that the difference between the two determines whether challenges become sources of suffering or opportunities for growth and wisdom. The third story, the teacher who spoke without words. In a valley where rivers converged and cherry blossoms painted the landscape in delicate pink hues, there lived a Zen master whose reputation had spread throughout the realm. Yet this teacher was known not for eloquent speeches or complex philosophical treatises, but for something far more mysterious and profound. Master Keegan had not spoken a single word in over 20 years. Students travelled from distant provinces to study under this silent teacher, drawn by stories of those who had achieved profound insights simply by spending time in his presence. The master's monastery operated with remarkable efficiency and harmony, despite the absence of verbal instruction or guidance. One morning, a scholar arrived at the monastery gates, his mind heavy with questions about the nature of enlightenment and the proper methods of spiritual practice. This learned man had studied under numerous teachers, memorized countless sutras, and engaged in philosophical debates at the most prestigious temples across the land. The scholar was shown to Master Kaigan's modest quarters, where he found the teacher sitting in perfect stillness beside a small garden. The morning sun cast gentle shadows through the bamboo, creating patterns of light that danced across the master's serene features. Eager to begin what he anticipated would be a profound discussion, the scholar launched into a series of complex questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between meditation and wisdom, and the proper understanding of Buddhist doctrine. His words filled the quiet space like autumn leaves scattered by wind. Master Keegan listened with complete attention, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that seemed to encompass the scholar's questions before they were even fully formed. Yet when the learned man finished speaking, the master's response came not through words, but through a simple gesture that would transform everything. The teacher slowly raised his hand and pointed to a spider spinning its web in the corner of the garden. The morning dew had collected on the delicate strands, creating a masterpiece of natural engineering that caught and reflected the early light in countless tiny prisms. The scholar followed the master's gaze and observed the spider's methodical work. Each thread was placed with precision, each movement purposeful and efficient. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no elaborate planning. The spider simply moment with perfect appropriate responded to each atonus, creating beauty through complete presence with. As minutes its task passed in contemplative silence, the scholar began to notice subtleties he had previously overlooked. He saw how the spider worked without anxiety about the finished product, how each strand supported and was supported by the others, how the entire web emerged naturally from the spider's authentic expression of its nature. Master Kaigen then gestured toward the scholar's own hands, which had been restlessly fidgeting with his prayer beads throughout their encounter. The learned man suddenly became aware of his nervous energy, the way his mind had been racing through concepts while his body remained disconnected from the present moment. The contrast between the spider's natural presence and his own mental agitation became strikingly clear. Here was a creature living in perfect alignment with its essential nature, while he, despite all his learning, remained trapped in endless thinking about life rather than fully living it. Without speaking, the master began a simple tea ceremony, each movement deliberate and graceful. The scholar watched as water was heated, leaves measured, and tea poured with the same quality of attention the spider had given to its web weaving. Every action flowed naturally from the previous one, creating a seamless expression of mindful presence. As the scholar received his cup of tea, he noticed how his hands had naturally steadied, how his breathing had deepened without conscious effort. The master's wordless teaching was already transforming his state of being through direct transmission rather than conceptual explanation. The warm ceramic against his palms became an anchor to the present moment. The subtle fragrance of the tea opened his senses to immediate experience rather than abstract thinking. The quiet companionship of sharing this simple ritual created a space of profound intimacy that no amount of philosophical discussion could have achieved. Hours passed without a single word being exchanged, yet the scholar felt he was receiving the most comprehensive teaching of his life. Through Master Kaigen's presence and simple actions, he began to understand that enlightenment was not something to be grasped through intellectual effort, but recognized through direct engagement with each moment. When evening approached and temple bells began their gentle calling, the scholar prepared to leave with a heart transformed. He bowed deeply to Master Kaigen, understanding now that the most profound truths are often transmitted through silence, presence, and the eloquent language of authentic being. As he walked down the mountain path, the scholar carried with him not new concepts to analyze, but a direct taste of the peace that emerges when the mind stops its constant commentary and simply rests in awareness itself. The fourth story, the disciple who lost everything. Beyond the bustling markets and crowded cities, where the noise of human ambition faded into the whisper of mountain winds, there lived a devoted practitioner named Jishin. For 15 years, he had dedicated himself to spiritual practice with unwavering commitment, following every precept, maintaining strict discipline, and accumulating what he believed to be substantial wisdom. Jishin's daily routine was precisely ordered. He rose before dawn for meditation, chanted sutras with meticulous attention, performed his work duties with mindful care, and retired each evening after final prayers. Other practitioners often looked to him as an example of dedication and proper conduct. His small dwelling reflected his disciplined approach to spiritual life. Sacred texts lined simple wooden shelves, meditation cushions were arranged with geometric precision, and ritual implements were maintained in perfect condition. Every aspect of his environment supported his practice and reinforced his identity as a serious student of the way. One autumn morning, as golden leaves danced on crisp mountain air, Jishin returned from his regular pilgrimage to a distant shrine to find his worst fears realized. During his absence, a fire had swept through the monastery complex, consuming many buildings, including his own quarters. Everything he had accumulated over 15 years of practice was gone. His precious collection of sutras, carefully copied by hand over countless hours, had turned to ash. The meditation bell passed down from his teacher, the ceremonial robes that marked his advancement in training, the journal containing years of insights and reflections, all had vanished in the flames. Standing before the smouldering remains of his former life, Jishin felt something crack open inside him. The careful structure he had built around his spiritual identity lay in ruins, leaving him face to face with a stark question. Who was he without all these external supports? His fellow practitioners gathered around him with expressions of sympathy and concern. They spoke of the tragedy of losing such valuable texts, the irreplaceable nature of his handwritten journals, and the difficulty of starting over after so many years of accumulation. Yet as Jishin listened to their well-meaning condolences, something unexpected began to emerge from the depths of his being. Where he had expected to find devastation, he discovered a strange sense of lightness. The weight he had carried for so long, the responsibility of maintaining and protecting his spiritual possessions, had been lifted without his conscious choice. That evening, as he sat on a borrowed cushion in temporary quarters, Jishin found his meditation deeper than it had been in years. Without his familiar surroundings and ritualistic supports, his attention turned inward with unprecedented clarity. The silence felt more vast, the awareness more spacious. His teacher, the wise Master Aizen, visited him the following day. The old master surveyed the destruction with calm eyes before settling beside his student among the ashes. Jishin began to apologize for the loss of the precious texts and ritual objects that had been in his care. Master Aizen listened quietly, then asked a question that pierced through conventional thinking like an arrow finding its mark. The teacher's inquiry revealed the profound teaching hidden within what appeared to be a terrible loss. Through their dialogue, Jishin began to understand that his attachment to spiritual possessions had become a subtle form of materialism, no different from worldly accumulation except in its objects. He had been collecting dharma like treasures, creating an identity around his spiritual achievements rather than embodying the freedom that practice was meant to reveal. The fire had not destroyed his true practice, but had revealed what was indestructible within him. The wisdom he had gained through years of sincere effort remained untouched by flames. The compassion he had cultivated still flowed naturally from his heart. The peace he had discovered in meditation needed no external confirmation or support. In the weeks that followed, Jishin noticed profound changes in his approach to practice. Without the familiar routines and possessions that had previously defined his spiritual life, he was forced to rely on the essential awareness that had always been present, but often obscured by his attachment to forms. His meditation became less about following prescribed techniques, and more about resting in natural presence. His study of Dharma shifted from accumulating knowledge to allowing wisdom to emerge from direct experience. His interactions with others became less concerned with maintaining his image as a serious practitioner and more focused on authentic connection and service. Other students began to notice the transformation in Jishin. Where once he had seemed slightly rigid in his devotion, now he moved with natural ease. His laughter came more readily, his advice felt less rehearsed, and his presence carried a quality of freedom that drew people naturally toward him. Master Aizen observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. In losing everything external, his student had discovered what could never be lost. The fire had been a harsh teacher, but it had accomplished what years of conventional instruction had been unable to achieve. The recognition that true spiritual wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in our capacity to remain present and open regardless of circumstances. Years later, when new students would come to Jishin seeking guidance about the proper way to maintain their practice, he would often share the story of the fire that consumed his possessions but revealed his true nature. He would explain how the greatest teachings sometimes come disguised as losses. and how freedom often emerges not from gaining more, but from discovering what was already complete within us. Through this unexpected teaching, Jishin learned that the path to awakening is not about building a perfect spiritual life, but about recognizing the perfection that exists beneath all our constructions and achievements. The fire had been his liberation, burning away everything unnecessary to reveal the unshakable peace that had been his birthright all along. The fifth story, The Village Baker's Gift. In a wheat fields, SW small village, nestled between rolling hills, where the summerade like golden oceans in breeze, there lived a baker whose modest shop filled the early morning air with the aroma of fresh bread. This baker, known simply as Kenji, had inherited his trade from his father and before him, continuing grandfather a family tradition that spanned generations. Kenji's bakery served as more than just a place of commerce. It had become the heart of village life. Each dawn, before the first rooster crowed, he would begin his work, kneading dough with the same rhythmic motions his ancestors had perfected. His hands moved with practiced grace, creating sustenance that would nourish bodies and bring families together around their humble tables. The villagers relied on Kenji not only for their daily bread, but for the warmth of human connection his shop provided. Children would press their noses against his windows, watching in wonder as he shaped loaves with gentle precision. Elderly neighbours found comfort in the routine of their morning news visits, sharing and concerns over cups of tea while the ovens radiated their welcoming heat. Despite the central role his bakery played in village a quiet life, Kenji had always felt longing for something deeper. He observed how the travelling monks who occasionally passed through their settlement carried themselves with a peace that seemed to radiate from within. Their simple presence suggested they had discovered something valuable that remained elusive to him despite his comfortable life and respected position. One particularly busy harvest season, when the village buzzed with activity and his bakery overflowed with customers celebrating the year's abundance, an unexpected visitor appeared at Kenji's door. This was no ordinary traveller, but a Buddhist teacher whose reputation for wisdom had spread throughout the region like ripples on still water. The teacher arrived just as Kenji was closing his shop for the evening, flour still dusting his apron and exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. Rather than seeking lodging or a meal, the visitor simply stood quietly outside the bakery, observing the final rituals of Kenji's workday with gentle attention. Curious about this unusual stranger, Kenji approached and offered the hospitality that was second nature to his generous spirit. He invited the teacher inside, prepared tea from his small reserve, and presented a selection of the day's remaining bread with the same care he showed his most valued customers. As they sat together in the dim light of oil lamps, Kenji found himself sharing thoughts he had never spoken aloud. He described his sense that despite finding satisfaction in his work and respect essential, was missing from his community, something his life. He spoke of his admiration for the monks he had encountered and his curiosity about the source of their evident contentment. The teacher listened with complete presence, neither. When Kenji finished speaking, judging nor offering immediate advice, the wise visitor asked to observe his bread-making process, explaining that he was curious about the craft that brought such obvious joy to the baker, despite his spiritual restlessness. The next morning, before dawn broke over the village, Kenji began his usual routine with the teacher watching silently from a corner of the bakery. As flour met water and salt, as yeast awakened to begin its transformative work, as dough yielded to patient kneading, the teacher observed each step with the same attention a scholar might give to sacred texts. Hours passed as Kenji worked, his movements falling into the familiar rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. The teacher remained motionless, his eyes following every gesture, every subtle adjustment, every moment of careful timing that turned simple ingredients into nourishment. When the first batch of bread emerged from the ovens, golden and fragrant, filling the bakery with warmth and the promise of sustenance, the teacher finally spoke. His words revealed insights that transformed Kenji's understanding of his daily work and its relationship to the spiritual path he had been seeking. The teacher helped Kenji recognize that his bakery was already a temple, his kneading a form of meditation, his service to the community an expression of compassion in action. Every loaf he created represented an act of love, transforming basic elements into something that nourished life itself. Through this conversation, Kenji began to see that the peace he admired in the monks was not dependent on renouncing worldly activity, but on bringing complete presence and sincere intention to whatever work life had placed before him. His hands, already skilled in their craft, needed no additional training to become instruments of spiritual practice. The teacher remained in the village for several days, spending each morning in the bakery and each evening in quiet conversation with Kenji. Through their exchanges, the baker discovered that enlightenment was not found by abandoning his responsibilities, but by approaching them with awakened awareness. Kenji learned to feel the dough's readiness through his fingers as a meditation on sensitivity and timing. He experienced the heat of the ovens as a reminder of the transformative power that turns raw potential into realized blessing. The daily rhythm of serving customers became an opportunity to practice generosity and mindful presence. When the teacher finally prepared to continue his journey, Kenji felt no desire to follow him or abandon his bakery. Instead, he understood that his path lay in bringing the same quality of attention that monks applied to their formal practice into every aspect of his work and service. The villagers began to notice changes in their beloved baker. His bread seemed somehow more satisfying, his demeanor more peaceful, his shop an even more welcoming refuge from life's difficulties. Though they could not articulate exactly what had shifted, they sensed that Kenji had discovered something precious without leaving the familiar surroundings of his daily life. Years later, other seekers would occasionally find their way to Kenji's bakery, drawn by stories of a simple baker who had found enlightenment without abandoning his calling. He would welcome them with the same warmth he showed all visitors, sharing bread and wisdom with equal generosity, demonstrating that the sacred can be found wherever sincere service meets awakened presence. The sixth story: the student of perfect memory. High in the mountains where clouds clung to ancient peaks like prayer flags in the wind, there stood a monastery renowned for its vast library and scholarly traditions. Within these walls lived hundreds of monks dedicated to preserving and studying the sacred texts that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom. Among these learned brothers was Myoan, a young monk whose intellectual gifts had been recognized from his earliest days in the monastery. Blessed with an extraordinary memory, he could recite entire sutras after hearing them only once, debate complex philosophical points with remarkable precision, and synthesize teachings from different traditions with impressive sophistication. Myoan's abilities had not gone unnoticed by his teachers, who entrusted him with increasingly important responsibilities. He was chosen to lead study groups for newer students, invited to participate in advanced seminars with visiting scholars, and asked to serve as scribe for important documents that would be preserved for future generations. The young monk took great pride in his intellectual accomplishments, viewing his sharp mind as both a gift to be honored and a tool for advancing his spiritual development. He approached his studies with meticulous dedication, often spending entire nights by candlelight, memorizing texts and cross-referencing different interpretations of challenging passages. His daily routine reflected his commitment to scholarly excellence. Each morning after meditation and chanting, he would spend hours in the library, absorbing new teachings and reviewing previously studied materials. Afternoons were devoted to discussion groups where he would share his insights with fellow students, often impressing them with his ability to quote relevant passages from memory. As his reputation for learning grew throughout the monastery, Myoan began to notice that other monks sought his guidance on doctrinal questions and looked to him as an authority on matters of Buddhist philosophy. This recognition fed his sense of purpose and reinforced his belief that intellectual mastery was the most direct path to enlightenment. One autumn day, as leaves turned brilliant colors and fell like scattered jewels around the monastery grounds, a wandering teacher arrived, seeking temporary shelter. Unlike the scholarly monks who populated the mountain retreat, this visitor appeared simple and unlearned, his robes worn from travel and his manner unpretentious. The abbot assigned Myoan the task of providing hospitality to their guest, a responsibility he accepted with mixed feelings. While he respected the monastery's tradition of welcoming all sincere seekers, he privately wondered what wisdom this apparently uneducated traveller could possibly offer to their community of learned scholars. During their first meal together, Myoan attempted to engage the visitor in conversation about various aspects of Buddhist doctrine, hoping to assess the depth of his understanding. He quoted passages from obscure texts, referenced debates between different schools of thought, and demonstrated his familiarity with complex philosophical distinctions. The wandering teacher listened patiently to Myoan's display of erudition, nodding occasionally, but offering little in the way of response. When the learned monk finished his exposition on the nature of consciousness, according to various interpretive traditions, the visitor asked a single, seemingly simple question that caught Myoan completely off guard. The teacher's inquiry cut through all of Myoan's accumulated knowledge like a blade through silk, pointing to something immediate and undeniable that no amount of scholarly study had prepared him to address. For the first time in years, the young monk found himself without a ready answer, his vast memory suddenly seeming inadequate to the task at hand. That evening, as Myoan sat in his cell surrounded by the texts that had been his constant companions, he found concentration elusive. The visitor's question echoed in his mind, revealing gaps in his understanding that all his memorized sutras had not filled. He began to recognize that somewhere in his pursuit of intellectual mastery, he had lost touch with the direct experience that all the texts were meant to point toward. Over the following days, the wandering teacher remained at the monastery, participating quietly in daily activities without drawing attention to himself. Myoan observed him during meditation periods, noting the quality of stillness he embodied that seemed to arise not from effort or technique, but from a natural settledness of being. During work periods, when the community engaged in practical tasks necessary for monastery maintenance, the visitor approached each activity with the same focused presence he brought to formal practice. Whether sweeping floors, preparing food, or tending the garden, he moved with an efficiency and grace that transformed mundane chores into expressions of mindful awareness. Gradually, Myoan began to spend less time in the library and more time observing this unassuming teacher, whose presence seemed to convey what years of study had failed to transmit. He noticed how the visitor engaged with each moment fully, without the constant mental commentary that characterized his own approach to experience. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, the teacher shared insights that revealed the limitation of approaching spiritual development, primarily through intellectual accumulation. His words, though simple, pointed to truths that Myoan's sophisticated analyses had somehow managed to miss. Through their conversations, the young monk began to understand that all his memorized texts were like detailed maps of a territory he had never actually visited. His impressive ability to quote sutras and explain philosophical positions had created an illusion of understanding while keeping him removed from the direct realization that such knowledge was meant to facilitate. The teacher helped Myoan recognize that true wisdom arose not from accumulating more information about enlightenment, but from cultivating the awareness and presence that allowed enlightenment to reveal itself naturally. All the texts he had memorized pointed toward this immediate reality, but intellectual comprehension alone could never substitute for direct experience. When the wandering teacher finally prepared to continue his journey, Myoan felt profound gratitude for lessons that had transformed his entire approach to practice. He understood now that his gifts of memory and analysis were valuable tools that could serve awakening, but only when balanced with direct cultivation of presence and awareness. In the years that followed, Myoan became known not only for his scholarly abilities, but for the wisdom that informed his understanding. His teaching integrated intellectual precision with embodied realization, helping future students avoid the trap of mistaking knowledge about the path for walking the path itself. The seventh story, the merchant's last transaction. In the bustling commercial district of a great city, where silk roads converged and fortunes were made and lost with the changing seasons, there lived a merchant whose success in trade had brought him wealth beyond his youthful dreams. Ichiro had spent 30 years building his empire, establishing trade routes that stretched across distant kingdoms and accumulating resources that placed him among the most influential citizens of his community. His compound reflected the fruits of his commercial acumen. Warehouses stored precious goods from far-off lands, spices that perfumed the air, silks that caught light like captured rainbows, jade carvings that spoke of master craftsman's skill. His residence showcased treasures collected during decades of travel, each piece representing successful negotiations and profitable ventures. Despite his material abundance, Ichiro found himself increasingly troubled by questions that his success had not answered. As he entered his 60th year, awareness of life's finite nature cast shadows over achievements that had once brought unqualified satisfaction. The energy that had driven his commercial transactions could not fulfill for meaning that by a deeper long ambitions was gradually being replaced. Late one evening, as he reviewed ledgers documenting another profitable season, Ichiro made a decision that surprised even himself. He closed his books, extinguished his lamp, and walked through his seeing familiar surroundings with fresh eyes. Something compound with the slow deliberation of someone had shifted within him. Creating space, Ichiro began implementing changes that left for priorities he had long ignored. The next morning, his business associates bewildered and his family concerned for his mental by visiting each of his employees' state. His stark necessity required. His generosity, personally, increasing the erosity extended to vendors' working conditions beyond what competitive compensation and improving there through neighborhoods where his workers lived, observing first negotiated agreements actions, while appreciated by their benefit to ensure fairer distribution of profits. These and partners, as he had less time in his offices and more time walking Ichiris, represented only the beginning of Ichiro's transformation. He began spending and the conditions his prosperity had been built upon. What he saw there stirred emotions that years of focus on profit margins had numbed. As weeks passed, Ichiro's changes became more dramatic. He established funds to support widows and orphans in his community, opened his warehouses to distribute goods to families struggling with poverty, and used his influence to advocate for policies that would benefit common laborers rather than just wealthy merchants like himself. His business partners grew increasingly concerned as they watched Ichiro's behavior diverge from the calculating pragmatism that had made him successful. They arranged meetings to discuss what they perceived as his deteriorating judgment, warning him that his charitable the enterprise impulses would ultimately destroy he had spent decades building. One of his oldest associates, a man who had known Ichiro since his early days as a struggling trader, finally confronted him directly about his apparent loss of business sense. During their conversation, something profound occurred that revealed the deeper transformation taking place within Ichiro's heart and mind. Through this exchange, Ichiro articulated insights about the relationship between material success and genuine fulfillment that surprised even himself. He had discovered that his years of accumulation had created a hollow replica of satisfaction, while the real nourishment his to the welfare of others, rather than Maxim's soul craved, lay in contributingizing his personal gain. The merchant explained to his concerned friend that his recent actions did not represent a rejection of commerce, but a reorientation of its purpose. He had come to understand that business could serve as a vehicle for creating benefit beyond personal profit, transforming economic activity from a means of accumulation into a form of service. This conversation marked a turning point not only in Ichiro's approach to his enterprises, but in his entire relationship with the material world. He began to see his resources not as possessions to be hoarded, but as tools that could alleviate suffering and create opportunities for others to thrive. Over the months that followed, Ichiro's businesses evolved to reflect his new understanding. While remaining profitable enough to sustain themselves and provide fair compensation to all involved, they now operated according to principles that valued human welfare alongside financial success. His warehouses became distribution centers for community support. His trade networks channels for sharing resources, rather than merely extracting profit. The transformation in Ichiro's enterprises paralleled changes in his personal life. The anxiety that had accompanied his earlier pursuit of wealth gave way to a peace that deepened with each act of generosity. His relationships with family and friends became more authentic as he released the need to maintain his image as a successful businessman above all other considerations. Word of Ichiro's transformation spread throughout the commercial community, inspiring some and puzzling others. Younger merchants sought his counsel, hoping to understand how someone could achieve both material success and spiritual fulfillment. His example demonstrated that engagement with the world of commerce need not require abandoning compassion or ethical principles. In his final years, Ichiro became known not primarily as a wealthy merchant, but as a wise elder whose life bridged the worlds of material success and spiritual understanding. His last great transaction was not a business deal, but the establishment of institutions that would continue his work of using economic activity as a means of serving the common good. Through Ichiro's story, many came to understand that the pursuit forces. His life demonstrated that material of wisdom need not be opposing of wealth, and the cultivation success could serve spiritual development when approached with right intention, and that the greatest profit resources but in the positive might be measured not in a cumulative impact of one's actions on the welfare of all beings. The eighth story, the guardian of the temple, Bell. In a temple perched on a cliff overlooking the endless sea, where salt winds carried the prayers of countless generations, there lived an old monk named Daishin, whose sole responsibility was caring for the great bronze bell that called the community to prayer. This bell, cast centuries ago by master artisans, possessed a voice so pure and resonant that its sound could be heard across the valley below, drawing hearts to stillness with its sacred tone. Daishin had been entrusted with this duty for over 40 years, and in all that time, he had never once failed to ring the bell at its appointed hours. Whether through scorching summer heat or bitter winter storms, whether in sickness or in health, the faithful monk would climb the narrow stairs to the bell tower and sound the rhythm call, that mark of monastic life. The other monks often marveled at Daishin's unwavering dedication. They watched him polish the bronze surface until it gleamed like captured sunlight, adjust the wooden striker schedule with infinite care, and maintain the rope-meticulous attention. His devotion that connected the bell to the prayerian to this single task had become legendary throughout the region. Yet as the years accumulated like fallen leaves around the temple grounds, Daishin began to develop his ability to fulfill experience changes that threatened his sacred duty. His legs, once strong enough to climb the tower steps multiple times daily without effort, now trembled with each ascent. His hands, which had gripped the bell rope with steady confidence for decades, sometimes shook with the palsy of advancing age. Most troubling of all, his memory, once reliable as signs of the sunrise, began to show confusion that sometimes accompanies great age. Occasionally, he would find himself standing in the bell tower, unable to recall whether he had already rung the call to prayer or if the appointed time still lay ahead. These moments of uncertainty filled him with a dread deeper than any physical discomfort. The younger monks noticed Daishin's struggles and quietly began to discuss among themselves whether the time had come for him to pass his responsibility to someone with steadier hands and clearer mind. Their concern was genuine and their reasoning sound, yet none felt comfortable approaching the elderly monk about relinquishing the duty that had defined his spiritual life. One autumn morning, as morning mist rose from the sea like incense from an invisible altar, Daishin climbed the tower stairs to ring the bell for dawn prayers. His ascent was slower than usual, each step requiring careful concentration to prevent a fall that could prove catastrophic at his age. When he finally reached the bell, his breath came in short gasps that echoed in the confined space. As he reached for the rope, a moment of complete disorientation overcame him. The familiar tower seemed suddenly foreign, the bronze bell like an artifact from someone else's life. He stood frozen, unable to remember not only whether he should ring the bell, but why he had climbed the stairs at all. The confusion was so complete that for several terrifying moments, he could not even recall his own name. Below in the meditation hall, the community waited for the bell's call to begin their morning practice. Minutes passed beyond the usual time, creating an unusual silence that gradually drew attention. Some monks glanced toward the tower, wondering if perhaps their elderly bellkeeper had overslept or fallen ill during the night. In the tower, Daishin remained motionless, trapped in a fog of confusion that seemed to grow denser rather than clearing. Just as despair began to overwhelm him, something extraordinary occurred that would transform not entire understanding of his life's work, only this moment of crisis but his. The sea wind, which had been merely a whisper, suddenly intensified, entering the tower through its open windows and striking the great bell with enough force to produce a soft, almost inaudible tone. This gentle sound, barely perceptible to human ears, somehow penetrated through Daishin's confusion like dawn breaking through storm clouds. In that moment of the wind's spontaneous bell ringing, the old monk experienced a profound recognition that dissolved his confusion and revealed a truth he had never fully grasped, despite 4 decades of faithful service. He understood that his role had never been to make the bell ring, but to allow its voice to emerge when conditions were appropriate. The bell possessed its own wisdom, its own timing, its own capacity to canalization. Came a release hearts to prayer. With this from the burden of believing that the community's spiritual welfare depended entirely on his personal effort and reliability. He saw how his attachment to being indispensable had created suffering not only for himself, but had potentially limited his understanding of the deeper forces at work in their shared spiritual life. The wind's lesson restored Daishin's clarity, but more importantly, it transformed his relationship to his duty. He reached for the rope not with the desperate grip of someone trying to control outcomes, but with the gentle touch of someone participating in a larger harmony. The bell's voice rang out across the valley, with a richness and resonance that seemed to surprise even the bronze itself. When Daishin descended from the tower that morning, the younger monks noticed something different in his demeanor. The anxiety that had been growing in his eyes for months had been replaced by a serenity they had never seen before. His movements, while still careful due to his age, carried a new lightness that seemed to defy his physical limitations. Over the following weeks, Daishin began sharing his duties with the younger monks, but not from a sense of failure or inadequacy. Instead, he taught them that caring for the bell was not about perfect execution of technique, but about cultivating the sensitivity to recognize when the moment was ripe for its voice to be heard. He showed them how to listen to the wind, to sense the community's readiness, to feel the subtle rhythms that governed the temple's spiritual life. His final years as bellkeeper were marked not by decline, but by a deepening wisdom that enriched the entire community's understanding of their practice. Through his transformation, they learned that true service often involves recognizing when to act and when to allow, when to maintain control and when to trust in forces larger than individual effort. When Daishin finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, the monks discovered that the great bell rang spontaneously that morning. Struck by the same sea wind that had taught there that day forward, they beloved elder his most profound lesson. From approach their duties with the understanding he had shared, that their role was not to force spiritual experiences, but to create conditions for the sacred to manifest naturally. The ninth story, The Mountain Hermit's Visitors. Deep in the wilderness, where no paths led and few humans had ever ventured, there lived a hermit monk who had withdrawn from society to dedicate himself entirely to the pursuit of enlightenment. Master Soen had spent 25 years in solitude, building a simple shelter from fallen logs and stones, cultivating a small garden that provided just enough sustenance to maintain life, and devoting every waking hour to meditation and contemplation. His retreat was so remote that even the hunters and woodsmen who occasionally remained unaware of his presence. This complete worked the lower slopes of the mountain isolation had been precisely what Soen sought: freedom from all distractions, all social obligations, all the endless complications that human interaction inevitably brought to spiritual practice. The hermit's daily routine was austere beyond what most people could imagine enduring. He rose each morning before dawn to sit in meditation as the first light touched the mountain peaks. His meals consisted of simple vegetables from his garden, wild plants he had learned to identify as edible, and occasional nuts or berries, gathered during brief foraging expeditions. Throughout the daylight hours, Soen alternated between sitting meditation, walking meditation along the narrow trails he had worn around his shelter, and the minimal maintenance work required to sustain his primitive lifestyle. As darkness fell, he would continue his practice by the light of oil lamps made from clay and fueled by rendered animal fat from creatures that had died naturally in the forest. This rigorous discipline had indeed brought Soen a degree of inner peace and clarity that he had never experienced during his earlier years as a monk in conventional monasteries. The silence of the mountains had taught him to hear the subtle movements of his own mind with unprecedented precision. The solitude had revealed layers of mental conditioning that remained invisible when attention was constantly warred by drawn-out social interaction. As the mountain hermit discovered when unexpected visitors arrived at his remote retreat, the greatest teachings often come not from isolation, but from the very interactions we think we're avoiding. These 10 Buddhist bedtime stories have guided us through profound wisdom, disguised as simple tales, each one revealing that enlightenment isn't found by escaping life, but by meeting it with awakened awareness. Whether in the merchant's empty bowl, the baker's daily bread, or the hermit's surprise guests, the path to peace reveals itself in the most ordinary moments when we learn to see with eyes of wisdom. May these ancient teachings settle into your dreams tonight, continuing to unfold their gentle guidance as you rest in the eternal stillness that is your true nature.